Hello, welcome to my Creative Critical Reflection 1. This will be my commentary on how we did things in our final film, Denial of Service. Today we ask the age-old question: how does our film use or challenge conventions, and how does it represent social groups and issues?
Well, hold on a minute. I haven't told you why I was inspired to create this film.
The main inspiration that we had for this film was from a game called Ready or Not, a tactical horror FPS that requires a substantial amount of teamwork to get anything done. This game contains a lot of dark imagery and content that may cause disturbance in many viewers and players. However, the protagonist takes the form as a police officer, and he is not alone. He's accompanied with his friends. Our idea of having this inspiration from this game was from the main topic of illegal substance use. And as mentioned in our film multiple times, we had illegal substances mentioned in form of a plastic bag throughout the whole film. We also had to incorporate another aspect of the game where a corrupt cop is mentioned. Now, corruption is a main thing, a main problem that we all know that we still struggle to deal with. We believed it was a good thing to incorporate it into our film. Now, moving forward, onto the narrative, our conventions, and the different conventions that we challenged.
So, the first thing I would like to address in our narrative is that we challenged a convention of showing the protagonists right away after the establishing shots of an action film. So, instead, we had originally planned to show two characters that are on the side of the antagonist. One that would only be used for the drug deal, and the other who would play a much more important role later on in the film. Next, in our narrative, we followed a linear structured timeline as our first followed convention. This means we went from the beginning of what started this whole ordeal in our film to what practically is the beginning of the actual film itself, as our creation is only a film opening. So the main social issue that we're trying to represent through our narrative is that criminal influence can have a severely negative impact on the justice system. That means it can essentially corrupt cops. So criminal influence and criminal activity may include bribery or other forms of corruption. Now, whenever a department or a singular police officer is corrupted by these criminals, it allows criminal activity to remain unchallenged and unopposed. Moving on to camera work. The convention that we used in our camera work is that we mostly used high angles, low angles, 2 shots, 1 shots, and establishing shots, as we needed to switch between scenes with relative effectiveness and consistency. And not only that, most of the interactions between the characters are done in 2 shots, which became a main part of our film, which is also one of the conventions that we follow. For starters, a convention we used in camera work, and we challenged at the same time, was a canted angle shot. Since the canted angle shot is not very well known, recognized, or used by many film companies alike, we decided to use it as a way to become more unique. Since we used the canted angle shot, we wanted to express this canted angle shot by expressing the character's emotions, specifically the antagonists in this drug bust, which is exactly why we used it. What we wanted to represent through our camera work is that the protagonist and the antagonist is presented in a way that makes sense, as most film studios would normally do. What I mean by that is that the protagonist is seen as this determined underdog, and the antagonist is already seen as this powerful, authoritative, controlling, infamous figure that pretty much seems unstoppable. A bit like a David versus Goliath scenario. What we also wanted to represent is that the pressure that criminals will go through when it comes to high-stakes scenarios, like a shootout. We use a canted angle for this specifically, since it's mainly what film studios use for psychological scenarios, or like high intensity in terms of emotion. Moving forwards onto editing. The first convention that we challenge is that we deviated from the actual genre of the film for a bit by adding in an unrealistic, annoying, rapid few cuts. This was included in our final few seconds of the final scene in the final film. This convention is normally used in other films and not specifically action films. However, the conventions that we followed in editing is that we used a series of fast cuts between shots in order to correlate to the film's fast pacing for an action film. We also followed the convention of introducing different locations at the start of different establishing shots, or wide shots, before cutting to the start of the scene. What we wanted to represent through our editing is that we wanted to represent how most film studios would normally edit their footage for their films to reveal their antagonist later on in the film, whilst revealing and introducing the protagonist almost immediately in their film to give clarity for the film. However, we wanted to be a little bit more unique, and we didn't follow this exact procedure in the creation of our film. Instead, we tried to be more unique and revealed our antagonist fairly quickly in the start of our film opening, and introducing our protagonist later on in the film, reversing the roles of the industry's standard procedure. Now, moving on to sound. As always, a convention that we challenged in our film in terms of sound is that, referring back to the old challenge convention in editing, we overused a single sound effect in a consistent, rapid series of cuts. Yet again, this almost never happens inside of most action films, as it steers away from the realism part of action, even though they typically aren't realistic, and leans more into an attempt of being comedic. Moving on to our conventions followed. So we followed the standard industry convention of using sound effects to match with the actions of the subjects in our film. If we didn't not have or was able to recreate any sounds to match those actions in the film originally. We also followed another standard industry convention of using a non-diegetic music or diegetic ambience when it came to certain scenes of the film, most notably the failed drug bust and the establishing shot of the intersection in Hong Kong. So what we tried to represent through our sound is that we often used it in our film to mostly describe the events and other actions made by certain people in the film. We often use voice changers to cover the police radio chatter that occasionally appear in the film opening, whenever the protagonist was on scene. However, we did not create any radio chatter for the antagonists, as to create the sense that the antagonists did not have any forms of communication, and could only communicate via speaking to one another, whilst the protagonists are more coordinated and well-informed. This is to simulate the antagonists are these criminals, and they don't have access to this walkie-talkies or external devices that allows them to communicate with one another. You better buckle up, grab some snacks, grab some popcorn, because you're in for a wild ride, and a long one too. Here it comes, mise en scène. Let's get started. In terms of costume and mise en scène, we used a white formal uniform instead of a recognizable police uniform in terms of blue colors for characters during working hours, specifically the protagonist, challenging the standardized familiar concept of police officers wearing blue or badges or even a little police cap, an officer cap, sorry, during working hours. By wearing a white formal attire that similarly represented men's fashion in terms of business clothes in the late 1980s. Now, for police raiders, in terms of costume again, a convention that we followed is that they used tactical gear and equipment, helmets, gas masks, vests, etc. Dark muted colors for regular attire underneath all the equipment, and weapons visible at all times, either carried or via sling or holding it. However, the challenge convention in this part is that a regularly used convention in a lot of action films is that whenever a member of the police is involved during a raid, for example, they would normally carry a sidearm with them alongside a small visible pouch on the side for carrying said firearm. Instead, we only had limited amounts of weapons, so we did not have sidearms. Now, for the cartel members. So, when we went for the costume design, the convention that we followed is that we went for the dark, warm, cold colors with that casual, informal style of attire. As in, so most of the bad guys, these cartel members, are normally depicted as the criminals in many action film conventions. So that's the convention that we followed. But how we challenge it is normally with the outfits of cartel members, they would wear some kind of informal, casual outfit. But since our film revolved around a criminal organization that was coordinating and proceeding with deliberate criminal activities, we challenged the convention that the members of the cartel would wear clothing that suits the theme of their cartel. So, last but not least, the cartel leader, the main man. In terms of his costume, we decided to follow the convention of using intimidating clothes, these dark, muted colors. As for many villains, main villains of a action film would normally be this really intimidating figure with some kind of class to him. But the challenge convention that we went for him, and, well, for his film, is that normally with someone with high importance in a cartel would be a lot smarter with how they represent themselves as to not draw attention or to assert dominance and control over the cartel. But we challenged that by making the cartel leaders stand out slightly to the other cartel members, but still keeping the intimidating factor to him. Now, for the setting. We decided on following the convention of having the drug deals happen in remote areas and locations away from general public view, as in most action films that contains these dark themes. But in terms of the conventions that we challenged, regularly with criminal activity, it happens away from public areas, but we challenged that by starting the setting in a public area nearby a river in Hong Kong, before returning to follow the standardized convention that we just challenged. Now, for props. So the convention that we followed for this section here in mise en scène is that for action films, the convention that we followed, weaponry is involved, obviously, That means sidearms, firearms, SMGs, etc., etc. You know the deal. Barrels and the small plastic bag seen in our film. But with the challenge conventions here, normally with most action films, a weapon is shown off pretty early in the film. But we challenged that by deliberately making a small plastic bag become the center of attention and the first prop to be used in the film, before eventually showing weaponry on camera. Now, for the title. A convention that we followed. We try to follow the standard conventions of an action film title by making it relate to the storyline of the film, as well as the main film's topic. Which is why we chose Denial of Service as the main film's title. Since the film we created is based around the distribution of illegal substances and resources, Denial of Service was the best original film title we came up with. In relation to the previous convention, we also tried to make the font of the title to be intimidating and slightly chaotic. So the conventions that we challenge here in our title is that most action films generally use an intimidating font that stands out from other fonts. Instead, we slightly used a different way of making our film title stand out by utilizing a font that makes our title stand out, create a sense of disarray, and adds a subtle hint of confidentiality. Now, for all you've been waiting for, the last few sections. Stereotypes. So, in terms of following stereotypes, our representations of the criminals that are involved with the cartel follow the stereotypical outfit in formal and intimidating attire to properly represent the almost carefree nature of how criminals would present themselves. However, in terms of our challenge stereotypes, we did challenge the stereotype of the police officers, as their outfits are stereotypically meant to be dark, almost a navy blue color. The way we challenged that stereotype is that we avoided using such clothing that are similar to or uses a blue color and replaced it with a very muted monochrome color, such as black and white, specifically white. Moving on to our genre conventions. So in terms of following genre conventions, our film should have followed the standardized genre conventions, as action films normally include the use of some form of weaponry or violence. Although there may not be any explosions or chase scenes that depict any high-stakes scenarios, we did, however, include a shootout scene in the form of a police raid, which was our own interpretation of what action films would normally include in the film itself. Last but not least, how did we represent issues? So, the main issue that our film tackled and represented is an issue that the world currently struggles to fix, is corruption. Since I've previously mentioned this in the other sections of this CCR, our film opening ends with a sudden betrayal in the shootout where the protagonist's colleague portrays the protagonist from the signal of the criminal leader's right-hand man, showing that he was already corrupt from the start. This was a clear way of representing how police forces across the world are facing with corruption, as many different police forces may include more than just one individual who might be corrupted via one of the ways, bribery. Well, this is the end. This is it. This is where it all is finalized. Not sure what to say here. Maybe it'll be better next year, I guess. Well, I'll take this as a good way to improve upon myself. Have a good day. Have a safe weekend, weekday, whatever it is. I'll be seeing you later. Goodbye.